Hi, I'm Jack Day, co-chair of the Wildlife Committee, and we're pleased to present this program today. We've got two very knowledgeable speakers, and one of them is a Laker. So I'll start with introducing our visitor, who is Bob Ford, and I'm going to cheat. I'll read with what you may have already read in Lake Views. He had a focus throughout his career on field ornithology and conservation biology. He was our bird expert leading us in some bird walks this morning. He has participated with the Tennessee Conservation League and the Nature Conservancy. And since 2000, he's worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and at one point was working under Paul Schmidt's leadership. And the two of them together worked on the first ever State of the Birds report for the United States in 2009. Paul, who lives here at the lake and is on the Watershed Management Committee, has had 40 years in the conservation field, working for 33 years as a biologist manager and ultimately a senior executive with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And he also spent 7 years as the Chief Conservation Officer for Ducks Unlimited. I also happen to know that we're talking about migratory birds and the Migratory Bird Act. I'm hoping that there'll be some mention of that, because I know that Paul has been to Washington recently to advocate for not weakening the Migratory Bird Act, because when we have things like the Exxon Valdez spill and the BP spill in the Gulf, that is one of the key mechanisms for getting legal action against the companies who are causing those. So that is more important than we might realize in our everyday lives. So with that, Paul.
Thanks. I'm not used to getting applause first, but that's great. Yeah, that's good. Just in case. Yeah, it might probably work out. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Jack. And yeah, we will talk a little bit about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Probably later in the program. We'll entertain you a little bit with some bird stuff first, and then talk a little bit about the policy and legal issues that Jack mentioned. First, as always, thanks for coming. And what a great morning it was for some of you. I see some familiar faces. We're walking this morning at Pleasant Grove Park. We had a great walk, two walks actually. It was popular enough we split it up, and discovered a lot at Pleasant Grove. So welcome back. So Bob and I would like to give you some information about migratory birds, show you some nice pictures along the way. And at the end, we think questions and answers will be very relevant so that we can kind of deal with those all at once. Some introductory, what I'll do is I'll have an introductory thoughts, sort of to kind of pique your interest about migratory birds. Then I'll have some specific observations and let me get the right slide now. Whoop. All right, do it right, Paul. So we'll have some specific observations. I've been here at the lake for about a year, and I want to talk a little bit about cavity nesting birds, and specifically to talk a little bit about the value of dead snags or dead standing trees, something that many of us probably think is a hazard or an eyesore or something. I think there's some value, and I want to talk a little bit about it. Also want to talk a little bit about waterfowl. I would be remiss if since I spent 7 years with Ducks Unlimited, not to talk a little bit about ducks and geese. So I'll do a little bit of that. Bob will cover a host of things, mostly about migration and some really interesting work being done to study migration and the changes associated with that. As we know, the climate is changing, our environment is changing. Humans have an incredible ability to change the environment, and birds can adapt. Question is how fast they can adapt to our changes. So Bob will cover some of that. I'll finish out with some maybe drier stuff, but I think just really important stuff about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and what it means and what's happening currently. First, I should start, I think, with just talking about some fun little things. That 2018 has been designated the Year of the Bird. Why would that be? Is that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is actually 100 years old. In 1918, some visionaries early in the century, some conservation leaders, tried and ultimately successfully established migratory birds as a federal issue or federal authority. Came about as a result of work with other countries and treaties, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But just to give you a sense, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, in my opinion, is the oldest and sort of longest standing conservation or environmental law we have. You don't have many that have been on the books for 100 years and are still, to this day, very effective at managing populations. So I think it's worth noting that, and it's also not as well known to people as the Endangered Species Act and other such legislation. So we'll talk a little bit about that more later. For me and I think many others, particularly those who were out on the bird walk today, maybe you. When we think about birds, we think that they are important to our lives, not just because of the benefits to the environment and to the economy, but I think ultimately it's what they do for our souls. It's how we connect, so many of us, is how we connect with the natural world. Many of us, including me, have early age experiences with birds, whether it's kids feeding ducks in the local urban park or a chickadee on the bird feeder. In my case, it was my mother and her connection with her bird feeder that ultimately sent me, I think, along with my fishing experience early on with my father, sent me on the pathway, the conservation pathway that sent me. But I suspect that each one of you in this room has a similar experience, whether it's identifying with a bird or some other outdoor experience that has brought you today to this point and probably has guided you in some way through your life. For the moment, I'd love to kind of just share with you what I think are some just amazing facts, just kind of, in my mind, mind-expanding kind of facts. There are about 10,000 different species of migratory birds in the world, 10,000 different species. In the United States alone, we have about 1,000 that are here at some point during their life cycle. As Bob and I were talking this morning, probably in this community, we have probably about 200 at any one point, not any one point in time, sometime during their life cycle, either passing through, nesting, wintering, whatever the case may be. So it's just kind of, to me, mind-boggling. There's so many different species out there. And if you were to see every bird species in the world, you would probably see this whole world. Imagine the scale. They are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. From every ocean to every desert to forest to prairie, even in Manhattan, New York. In fact, I went on a bird walk in Central Park a few years ago and was phenomenal birding in Central Park, in the middle of that metropolis. All shapes and sizes, colors, characteristics, many different kinds of migrations. And you're going to see some of those later when Bob talks a little bit. Birds are as diverse as your imagination. African flamingos can have flocks of 1 million birds. Roadrunners kill rattlesnakes for food. Thick-billed murres can dive 700 feet underwater. Peregrine falcons can fly at 240 miles an hour. Migrations are as diverse as the birds themselves and their flight. Eagles soar on thermals for forever, it seems like. Hummingbirds pause like a helicopter in front of your feeders, I'm sure. I've seen many since being here. European swifts stay aloft, for almost a year. Albatross spend 10 years at sea before returning to land to breed. And get this one really does blow my mind. A godwit has been documented to fly 7,264 miles nonstop, Alaska to New Zealand in 9 days. Just kind of incredible to me. Birds are our connection to the natural world, as I said earlier. And in fact, they are the proverbial canary in the coal mine. They are indicators of our environmental health, and they tell us a lot about how we're treating our natural world. So Lake Monticello, it has been a great place for Diane and myself to land after many years of working life, now retiring. We had no idea how rich it is, both in terms of a people community, but in terms of a bird and wildlife community. So it is a wonderful place to be. We have neotropical migrants here. We have soaring raptors, the eagles, the osprey, the hawks, the vultures. We got plenty of waterfowl. Just look out seasonally and you'll see the changes that occur out there in the water. And cavity nesting birds. And so I want to focus just a little bit now on and show you some photos associated with the cavity nesting birds and then waterfowl, and then I'll give it over to Bob. And I want to first, as I put up some of the slides, I'll call attention to this. Richard Crossley is to be credited with all of the pictures that I'm going to show you. And I have some of his bird guides up here in front. Richard Crossley is a terrific author and tries to connect photographs and wildlife photographs, bird photographs and people, and put them in places where people can appreciate their environment and the various different color phases that the birds have, et cetera. So I encourage you, flip through those birds books afterwards to kind of look at those birds, but you're going to see some of the beautiful photographs of Richard Crossley's during this time. So in Lake Monticello area, or I'll say more broadly, let's say Central Virginia, we have 85 species of cavity nesting birds. In North America, 26 of them nest in Virginia, They include ducks, wood ducks, and hooded mergansers are quite common. Owls, of course. Woodpeckers, you can see the myriad of species of woodpeckers that use snags. Swallows, chickadees, again, my mother's favorite. Nuthatches, wrens, and other species. I suspect most of us did not realize that dead trees had such a value. It's an incredible value for, indeed, those birds. And sitting between 7th and 8th hole on the Lake Monticello golf course, not very far from here, is this tree. Imagine the apartment complex associated with this tree. I hope, I've gone by this because I have now picked up golf in retirement, as a couple of you in the, well, they probably don't think it's golf when I play it, but it is chasing that white ball around. But it is phenomenal to go by this tree each time, and I hope that the landowner doesn't decide to cut this tree down. And I hope that it stays there, because it's a reminder to me every time I walk around the golf course of how important all the various habitats are, but in particular for this area, the trees. Did it again. So wood ducks. Wood ducks are very common, and in fact, I hope that everybody in this room has seen a wood duck in particularly a male in plumage sometime during their life. It is an incredible experience, an incredibly beautiful bird. As in most birds, the male tends to be more colorful and showy, and that is no more the case than with wood ducks. Wood ducks are, you can immediately tell the difference between the male and the female. They, as the mergansers, use old nesting trees, old dead trees for their nests. Typical view of where you might find wood ducks. And of course, the very plentiful woodpeckers that are ever abundant around Lake Monticello. I think in one day's time, we had to our suet feeder at least 3 or 4 different species of woodpeckers. And obviously, they are centered around trees and need trees for their food, but also for their shelter. Hairy woodpeckers, downy woodpeckers, whoop, and now the tree swallow. I know that all of you have seen them. They are very plentiful in and around the lake. They're very commonly used, the artificial nesting structures, including the one on our dock. And unfortunately, they are in decline, actually throughout their range. And there again, it reminds me of how important birds are to sort of an indicator of our environment. But they are, as in some other cases, some other common birds are in decline. That's part of the reason that the organization called Partners in Flight was established, is to call attention to common birds that are declining in population. And so, as an indicator, and as Jack indicated, Bob and I a few years ago decided to take the lead from actually Great Britain, who had the first that country had the first State of the Birds report. And I thought, what a great idea. Let's bring that idea to the United States and to raise the visibility of birds in their plight, if you will, not only their flight, but their plight, and call attention to some of the reasons for declines and what we can do. Anyway, I kind of digress a little bit from the wonderful tree swallow. Okay, chickadees. I could not have a slide without chickadees. So if you have bird feeders, I know they have been to your bird feeder. I don't know your bird feeder, but I know they've been to it. This species has certainly been there as well, or flitted around the trees in and out in your yard for sure. All of these require trees in their natural habitat to be nesting. White-breasted nuthatches, and of course the eastern bluebird. And I've just met Doug today, who takes care of all the bluebird houses along the golf course and keeps track of them and monitors them. And that I've heard his name before, but so thankful he's here today from Charlottesville to join us. But there's this pretty special species and very prevalent around here. And of course, you all know about the house sparrow, very prevalent, and the wrens. Some that you may not have seen, but still use snags, old dead trees, or the prothonotary warbler, a beautiful migrant and an occasional nester in this area. So when we don't have artificial trees, what do? We try to supplement those. And this community has done a fantastic job. I've seen wood duck boxes, I've seen the bluebird boxes, the martin houses, etc., all around the lake, all to the benefit of birds. And I know many of them get used. Now a little bit about waterfowl, just because it's one of my, one of the special things for me. As I said, I've connected to waterfowl at an early age, and certainly later in my career, I've spent a few years focusing on that with Ducks Unlimited. The mallard is particularly ubiquitous, year-round resident, but it's also a migrant. So the birds that you see around here are some of them are typically going to be here all year long. But you're going to see some influx of birds throughout the year, through the fall, in particular, birds that are going to come in, and there will be more mallards. And again, the male typically, the drake is much more colorful than the hen. The American black duck. You might not have seen one of these, and you might get this mistaken with the female mallard. They are very closely related genetically, but they are on the East Coast. They actually go all the way to including the Mississippi River. But eastern Canada and United States are quite common, but are easily misidentified and do interbreed, actually, with mallards. So you'll see some odd ducks out there. I guess pun was intended there. So blue-winged teal, if you blink, you'll miss them. They are going to be passing through. They're probably not very, very plentiful here along in this area, but I'm sure that they do come through here. But they are an early migrant and the longest distant waterfowl migrant. They'll nest up in the prairies and in northern Canada and fly all the way down to Mexico and beyond. So they are quite an interesting waterfowl and typically smaller than many of the other species. In the winter, take note when you're cold and looking out your window, if you happen to be on the lake or walking around at the beach, we have plenty of diving ducks that come here. And last year I was able to see, 4 or 5 different species of diving ducks out in the lake. They'll be here in the winter. And definite different characteristics from the dabbling ducks that I just mentioned before, the mallards, the black duck, and the blue-winged teal, all dabbling ducks. They feed a different way, and the divers, by their name, are different feeding types and also different just physiological structures. Common goldeneye are very plentiful. I've seen them out there. We saw last year scaup, not a duck, but common loon passing through. So you're going to see some winter influx of birds that use Lake Monticello. A couple of slides on, I just think I'd be remiss if I didn't throw a couple of slides up of osprey and maybe some eagles, because they are such fantastic flyers. The ospreys, I've seen them throughout the year out here at the lake. Common name is fishhawk and well named. They're going to feed most entirely on fish and oftentimes will capture a very large fish as it swoops down. So keep your eye out on the lake and above it for the osprey and the eagles. And in this slide in particular, I'll call attention to it because it was a bit of a conversation piece in Jackson Cove a few weeks ago when it was this big brown bird. Paul, what was it? And I quickly figured out, went over to Jackson Cove, and it was an immature bald eagle. So they don't always have the white head and white tail. Obviously, after a couple, 3 years, 4 years, they become that distinctive bird that you're so familiar with. But until that time, they're this large. On the right-hand side of my slide, at least, shows the immature phases of the bald eagle. But I think birds and birding is fun for all ages. So I leave it to my portion of this, at least, with the idea that it's something we can all enjoy, like we did this morning, actually walking out there in a group or by yourself. And it's great for kids. It's great to connect kids, and something that I think we all need to be responsible for, and that is to take kids outside. Get them away from these computers and the cell phone I have in my pocket that I'm sort of addicted to as well, but the kids are even more so, and to get them an experience outside. The medical community has shown so much the benefit of getting kids outside for their brains, but also for their bodies. So let's all take a little bit of responsibility for doing that. By the way, the fellow on the right-hand side is Richard Crossley, who is the author of a couple of those books, and is just a wonderful guy. And, you know, they're fantastic species. Who knew that they could read? With that, I present to you Bob Ford, and we'll get his slideshow up. I'll try again.
It's a beautiful lake, it's a beautiful community, and the enthusiasm around birds and conservation has been encouraging to me and to Paul and some of the discussions we've had this weekend. So thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, Jack, thank you for hosting me, and I really appreciate being here. I do see some familiar faces. Let's see. Yeah, several folks. Almost everyone probably in this room. Paul mentioned pileated, but everyone on this hike this morning kept mentioning pileated woodpeckers and how they were just showing up at their feeders and in their backyards. Folks see pileated woodpeckers, the real big. Y'all are killing me, man. Come on. Pileated woodpecker, of course, is the big, magnificent woodpecker that's used to be called the log god or the great bird of the forest, you know, because it's so magnificent, so big, and so loud. And I get to see them, but it's usually on field trips. And, you know, talking to people, that they come to your backyard, what a great place to be. Paul mentioned Partners in Flight, so I'll give the 2-second, that's my program, partnersinflight.org. Take a look at it sometime and tell me what you think. This morning we had like 35 species by my count from a hike. Paul and I got there about 7:30, 7:15. 2 hikes. Not everybody saw 35 species, myself included. A couple of people came up to me and added a bird or two to the list, and that's the way a community bird watching hike goes. Bluebirds, chickadees, cedar waxwings. Highlight was northern harrier. It's a hawk, sometimes called a marsh hawk, that came banking into the sun over low across the brush. It was really beautiful. One of the things that struck me, and in following Paul's talk there, was something about getting outdoors and how people get outdoors. What's interesting to me is that 150 years ago, people would have been out birding, but sorry ladies, it would have been almost all men. We probably would have had on a coat and even a tie, given the proximity to a nice community here. And we would have been with shotguns and not with binoculars, because binoculars were available, but they were primarily restricted to military and those types of uses. So to enjoy birds meant enjoying birds by shotgun. And there are several economic reasons to do that. You see the person behind the horse shooting waterfowl. Waterfowl went to restaurants in New York and lots of other big cities as a game bird. The guy in the corner on the right, the statue, is Frank Chapman, a colleague and protege of John James Audubon, who was at Cornell University and collected birds with gun for study and for identification. And he kept those birds just like Audubon to draw. That's one of his pictures there to the left. There was also the interest in getting birds for plumes and ladies' hats, and not just plumes. Sometimes entire birds would be on a lady's hat. And I mentioned Frank Chapman. I like to go with Frank Chapman instead of Audubon because he's a little bit more accessible to me. He's more personable. You know, I could be like Frank Chapman. I probably couldn't be like Audubon. But Frank Chapman took off from his uptown Manhattan office, walked down the street in 1886, and identified on ladies' hats 40 species of 174 different kinds of birds. Now, I don't know whether that makes him really nerdy or really cool, but it's right. It's right. Some of those hats are extravagant if you've seen them. It's pretty amazing. However, at the turn of the century in 1900, there was a strong movement, led largely by ladies and women, to replace indiscriminate shooting with using binoculars and other forms of studying birds. And I say indiscriminate importantly. I'll get back to that in a minute. You see the gun there is called a punt gun, and it was used to collect waterfowl for the restaurants. I'm most familiar, Paul, with use on the Chesapeake Bay, but a gun like this could kill 75 to 100 canvasbacks with one shot. And they would all go straight to the train and put on the train, often as they were, not cleaned or anything, and they would go straight to a New York restaurant where they were served. So in 1990, that kind of indiscriminate killing of birds between hats, recreation, restaurant businesses began to be too much. Frank Chapman, again, another reason I bring him up, from Cornell University, said, on Christmas, let's go out and count birds, because there was a long tradition of going out and shooting birds for recreation on Christmas Day. Let's go out and count birds instead of killing birds. That movement led to a stronger and stronger movement. Binoculars were still not readily available, but I know people who participated early on in the Christmas bird count years, early in the 1900s, and they would take a train out and walk around and see the birds that they could see with their eyes or however they could see those birds and report those back to Frank Chapman at Cornell. That kind of strong interest led to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, with Paul's going to talk a little bit more, which in turn towards the end of the century, towards the middle of the century, started leading more to science-based population management and how desiring a certain level of population of some birds equaled maintaining high-quality habitat. And with all of that, the technology behind being able to see birds, the technology with binoculars, spotting scopes, all kinds of cameras began to escalate. Birders took advantage of that in every single decade and used that to increase their bird watching ability, and that bird watching ability turned into those citizens using their observations, citizen science, to put forth some very meaningful data that helped to direct bird conservation. My story, let's make this very personal, very quick. A little past mid-century last century. 1962, that's me on Myrtle Beach. I like to think I was watching birds. My older brother tells me I'm watching girls down the beach, basically, but I never believe that. I'm watching birds. But I can tell you that as I grew older, those binoculars became pretty much a permanent fixture around my neck, either chasing birds in some form or fashion or other types of wildlife. I grew up it was in South Memphis. It was less than about 5 miles straight line to the Mississippi River. And in the fall, my dad was a duck hunter, and that's my love for ducks and birds, was growing up as a duck hunter and understanding that he could identify a bird like this pintail at half a mile away, and he could tell me how to do that myself. But more importantly, he used to build fires about this time of year in the backyard, just 5 miles away from the Mississippi River. And at night with that fire and hearing ducks and geese flying over, unseen but heard, and knowing that they had come from some adventurous place of Jack London to the north, going to some adventurous place to South Texas and ranchers in the south along the way, and South Louisiana just captured my heart. And it remains my passion. And so a lot of today I will talk about migration and how that works. As I got older, other birds like abundance of shorebirds in migration also really began to interest me, and it ties to not just migration, but also the abundance of birds. Sometimes we take that for granted, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I know these, sorry about the size of the print there, but I had to have some notes here so I could read a little bit. But I wanted to go over some things that, as Paul said about his facts, some things that really help you expand your mind around just how amazing birds are, and especially the phenomenon of migration. Well, why do birds migrate? In the beginning, they started to migrate because they were looking for food resources and longer summers during the breeding season. And that meant they could move north, get out of the competition where they are in the wintering grounds, and start to find more resources. How far and how long? It's a little bit variable, the distance. They might fly 8 or 10 hours, mostly at night. However, in all parts of the world, migratory birds have obstacles to cross. In this part of the world, the eastern United States, from Central and South America, that obstacle is the Gulf of Mexico. So some of the birds that we'll be talking about today cross the Gulf of Mexico. Blue-winged teal is one that goes from the Gulf shores of the United States straight to the Yucatan. And that's about 600 miles. And for a teal, it's a little bit less time than that, but for a songbird that weighs less than a first-class piece of mail, you could put a songbird in an envelope and send it to Belize faster than it could probably actually fly there, and cheaper. For whatever the cost of a stamp is now, 50 cents. But it might take 18 to 20 hours nonstop to get across the Gulf of Mexico. Almost all flight is nocturnal. That's a physiological thing. Birds can, they're designed so that they get to a certain elevation and altitude, and at night there's less humidity. They're more efficient at breathing and can make a nighttime flight work. Then they stop whenever they get tired. Mid-morning usually to rest, find fresh water and food. One of the things that, one of the interesting concepts in the last 3 decades, I guess, that people have talked about and still argue about is migration. Which end is home? That's a simple question, but, you know, stop to think about that a second. They nest here, they have their young, and so it's easy for us on this end of the migration to say, this is home. That bird nests right out there in that tree, so that's its home. But they spend about May, June, July, maybe August here, 4 months, and then they're packed up and leaving again with their chicks, going south. And so they're gone 8 months from this tree out here behind us to places along the way, along stopover migration route for some birds. Other birds make it all the way to Central and South America. One of the interesting points about migration and whether they're tropical birds or our birds in the temperate zones is coloration. There have been a couple of studies about how colorful tropical birds are for a variety of reasons. And a lot of our migratory birds are very colorful, probably originated in the tropics. And then that makes sense with the first point there. If they were in the tropics during the Ice Age and started to look for less competition and greater food resources, they started moving north a little bit as the glaciers receded, found some food, found some water, and it got a little colder, so they went back to the tropics, and the story goes. And over lots and lots of time, they began to make that annual migration in the spring and in the fall. Well, what are the real characteristics of a songbird migrating? I included here the best thing I could find, a series of buildings to give you an idea. Most birds fly at an altitude of 500 to 2,000 feet. The buildings there on the left side of the screen are a little over 2,000 feet, so to give you an idea of highest. However, there have been recordings of a goose at 37,000 feet. I'm not sure how they got that recording. Probably an airplane pilot looked out the window and said, "What the heck?" Or an airplane pilot that was a birder, even better. There you go. On average, it's not a hurried flight. It's just constant. Same speed limit as we have around here, right? 15 to 30 miles an hour, just going. Good tailwind. We could talk stories all day. I'll try not to, or I'll be here all afternoon. But a good tailwind, birds can go a lot faster, but if they hit a headwind, then they're in trouble. They go a lot slower. And especially if they're crossing the Gulf of Mexico, then it gets kind of spooky. Green-winged teal and others I mentioned move faster. The teal and bigger birds, they can go up to 60 miles an hour just during an average migration. Well, how do they do that? By bulking up. Anybody run marathons or know a little bit about exercise and then do long competitions? You know, you stay in shape, right? But then right before you race or right over, you kind of bulk up on carbohydrates or food that's going to get you through that tough spot. The birds do the same thing, often with caterpillars or other food that they find. They may increase their weight up to 50% to make it on the next leg of the journey. A good friend of mine, Mark Woodry, and Frank Moore on the Gulf Coast of Mexico on U.S. side, has studied this phenomenon of migration for quite some time and have caught and banded a lot of birds on the Gulf Coast. And they can hold a bird and you can blow the feathers apart and you can see how much fat is on the bird. They can look at a bird and say, I hope this bird doesn't leave today because it doesn't have enough fat to make it across Gulf of Mexico. Or this bird's ready to go, we probably won't see it again. And their banding has proven that out. The next day, the bird that didn't have enough fat, they may catch over and over again until it really gets fattened up. And the bird that they thought had enough fat on it to make it was gone. And they assumed safely across the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, how? I'll get off these slides in a minute and show you some pretty birds. But how? There's still a lot of unknowns about how. The best guess is it's a combination of stars and sun. They are nocturnal migrants. There's also something about Earth's magnetism that helps find their way. Larger animals that have more, like ducks, that have more strength to move distances and more resiliency to bad weather might have a combination of these things plus weather. And they might stay right at the ice line, ducks will, stay right at the ice line until everything freezes up and they realize they can't eat anymore, so they go a little bit further south. Some birds, and one of the most fascinating points to me in all of this the last 20 or 30 years has been understanding site fidelity. That's just a way of saying that a bird comes back to the same spot every year, all the time, till it dies, both on the breeding ground and the non-breeding ground for some species. When I say the same spot, I don't mean somewhere around Charlottesville, Virginia. I mean those 3 trees out there. More and more technology is increased to where little satellite transmitters can be put on these small birds to know where they go. I showed you a picture here of a golden-winged warbler, a study in Tennessee. This bird nests a lot over the eastern United States, but nests also in the southern Appalachian Mountains. And University of Tennessee studied this bird. It's a golden-winged warbler. It migrates. It showed up in East Tennessee mountains, defined a territory. There were 2 or 3 birds there, 2 or 3 males. They'd started to build a nest. The female was there. They put these little satellite transmitters on these birds. And that year, in late May or June, was the worst tornado year in Tennessee on record. I think through East Tennessee, there might have been 5 to 7 tornadoes come through in a span of 48 hours and really nailed this particular study area. And the guys were really worried about their birds and their study, especially the PhD student who thought that, man, I'm going to have another year in the field after this. But when they came back out in the field, they have to recapture the bird to get the data off that little transmitter in this particular case. They came back in the field, the birds were there, they were singing, they recaptured them, took the transmitters off the birds, found out that these birds had left 2 days before the tornadoes, flew all the way to Florida, sat out the tornadoes, flew all the way back to East Tennessee and showed up on their same nest territory in order to nest. It's an incredible phenomenon of migration and site fidelity. So incredible that early naturalists just couldn't believe it. From Aristotle to, I think Frank Chapman and Audubon had it. Well, not so much, actually. Audubon and Chapman had a few misconceptions about migration, but lots and lots of people, especially the long hunters like Jim Bridger and others you may be familiar with, thought that the swallows and the chimney swifts actually went underwater, dug into the mud, and hibernated all winter. Because they just didn't see them leave, and they didn't see them come back. They were just there one day. And that was the best they could think about. And in fact, the bird there in the lower right-hand corner, chimney swift, it goes all the way to Peru, and it was one of the last species where bird watchers and scientists, but bird watchers I want to emphasize, the citizen science, didn't know where that bird spent the winter, had no clue. We knew it wasn't underwater and under the mud, but had no clue where that bird was going to spend the winter every year. And there was a call from Cornell and others, Smithsonian, for citizens who could ban birds to ban every single chimney swift that they could. I'm a Memphis guy. I think I kind of implied that earlier, so I'll brag on one of my Memphis mentors for bird watching, Ben Coffey. He managed to ban several thousand chimney swifts in the late 1940s to help figure out this question. It took a couple of years, but a missionary was in a small village in Peru, way off the beaten path, and happened to notice that some of the birds that were being eaten had these little metal tags on their legs. He said, may I look at that? And of course they said yes. And then it said, return to U.S. government. So he thought, I should probably return that to the U.S. government. He took the bans, brought it back. Apparently it went around the State Department for a little ways, finally ended up with basically the agency that Paul and I work for, It was called the National Biological Survey, I guess, at the time. And they found out that these were chimney swifts, that they had been banded in Memphis, Tennessee. They were recovered in a small village in Peru, and that was the first breakthrough on where these birds spend the winter. And it wasn't until the 1940s and 50s until that was really figured out. Hummingbirds. Hummingbirds I like to talk about because they are so small, weigh about the same as a penny, but they can travel up to 30 miles an hour. And they cross directly over the Gulf of Mexico in their migration. They stop some in the Caribbean and make it all the way to Mexico. But that's 600 miles in about 20 hours for hummingbirds. They are diurnal migrants. That is, they migrate during the day as compared to some of the songbirds. And I have, it's really fun when you get to witness migration, whether it's ducks or other things. And I was on the Gulf Coast in Alabama birding during migration one day, and watching this hummingbird, just kind of just for fun of it. And suddenly the hummingbird took off, started making big circles all the way up in the sky, and I was going, what the heck? And I could barely see it, and it just took off south. And so I got back home and read about it, and that's how they start their migration. They just reach a certain altitude by flying in big circles and then take off. Arctic terns, a bird that is well known for seeing more daylight than any other species alive, any other living creature. It nests in the Arctic, but flies mostly over ocean to make it all the way to the Antarctic, and then returns to the Arctic each year. Another bird, this is a shorebird, a bar-tailed godwit, but it is a shorebird. It's the longest known nonstop flight for, well, nonstop. A tern, like I just mentioned, can rest on the water, but this bird flies nearly 7,000 miles over 8 days nonstop to go from Alaska to New Zealand for the winter. I started, and this is kind of a quick overview, a brief overview, but I started intentionally somewhat telling you what bird watching was like 150 years ago, and the use of the shotgun because binoculars weren't there, and then binoculars came on the scene, and through the 1900s, binoculars increased, and with it, bird watcher sophistication, and that sophistication has turned into a citizen science, which has been a great contribution to understanding bird conservation and wildlife and natural resource conservation. So more and more, we're beginning to think about how birds make it through that full annual cycle, their breeding ground, their non-breeding, or their stopover migration habitats, and how they do in those winter grounds. So I'm going to show you a series of things here, and I might, this is going to take just a little bit of an explanation. This is a cardinal. You see on the right there's a map. That's their range. That's where they nest. They are a resident species. They don't migrate. The little map you see in the left-hand, or the map you see in the left-hand corner of the United States, the brightest colors are the densest populations of cardinals. The lighter colors are lighter densities of cardinals. The line crossing at the bottom are the months of the year. This isn't important right now for cardinals, but bear with me. So that's January, moving into February, moving into March. If you look closely, you might see a bird or two move around on there. But these are based on real data collected by bird watchers, citizen scientists contributing to a program called eBird. I don't mean to be a commercial for Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but eBird is a start from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Now, okay, I was pushing the wrong button. Red-headed woodpecker, I understand there are some right here at the golf course, which are beautiful, beautiful birds, striking red head. They move around some. If you're on the hike this morning, there were some birds I talked about. Well, they move. You see them every month of the year here, but some birds move and some birds come in. So the bird you see in June may not be the same bird you see in January, which is the same true for red-headed woodpeckers. So watch this. January, they're kind of spread out, or starting to come into the southeast. Oh, breeding season. They move very much into the Midwest during the breeding season. They have taken advantage of acorn crops and understand, or at least can figure out some abundance of insects, where they are and how to move. So these birds move, you notice in Virginia and in much of the South, probably a resident population there, but the birds that are in the Midwest are definitely leaving the Midwest every year and coming into a different area. Next bird we saw some and talked about this morning as well, and you probably see this one at most of your feeders, white-throated sparrow. Now this bird comes here in the wintertime, but it nests in Canada, boreal forests of Canada, and along the edges of U.S.-Canadian border. Here it's winter, here it's winter, here it's winter, getting into spring, and the birds leave the United States. All based on real data and all valuable in the way that scientists can look at how birds distribute themselves. They come back in about this time of year. White-throated sparrows are starting to show up, at least I live in the D.C. area now mostly, and they really just started showing up within the last 2 weeks, which is borne out by this as well. Starting to get into the fall, and here they come again. I want to show you several different kinds of examples. This is a bobolink. Some of you may have grown up calling it a rice bird. One of the most, what's the right word? Nomadic birds of songbirds. They travel over 12,000 miles a year. Birders know, probably most of you do, that you just don't know where they're going to show up, to be perfectly honest. There's some good indications that they come back to same spots, have that site fidelity, but for the most part, they could one year be all over your backyard, and the next year, or not backyard, but your nearest hayfield, and in the following year, you won't see them. But they do leave the United States in the winter, so similar pattern to one of the first ones. They come back from South America, nest throughout the upper Midwest, prairie potholes, and hang around in the fall. You can see how much they move around there in the fall after breeding season, and then take off for our winter. Prothonotary. Paul mentioned this one too. It's, if you look at the range map there on the slide, it's this part of Virginia is right on the edge of the range, which makes it especially important maybe to put out some nest boxes and see if you get any here, be it contribution to the population. Prothonotary warbler, a question I usually get is, what's that name about? You know, but prothonotary, it comes from literally it means first judge. And in an older society, I think an English society in the 1600s, the first judge of the court came in with a yellowish robe and blue sleeves. So prothonotary. Yeah. Yeah, in 1900, this bird was called golden swamp warbler. I vote golden swamp warbler. So again, this bird's all over in the winter. This bird's in northern South America, some of the Caribbean islands, comes back through, invades and nests. Home or visitor, or is home both? I think the whole annual cycle is actually where these birds live. Home is where they are at that month of the year. I want to try to give you just two examples here real quick. These get a little boring after a while, but this is a bird, and this shows the North American continent. So this bird is in the winter in the Yucatan, comes up through the Appalachians as one of its strong points, and then nests. This is nesting season through the boreal forest in Canada and northeast, and some here just a little bit east of you in the mountains, and magnolia warbler. And then when it leaves, it goes down to Yucatan. One of the most striking things about this, when we think about conservation of this species and several species, is you notice that the breeding range spread almost all across northern Canada. But look at this winter range, concentrated in the Yucatan. And you think about the threats in the Yucatan with ecotourism development, water issues with climate change maybe, or other issues, then the bird definitely has some issues in its nesting grounds in the boreal forest, but so concentrated there in the Yucatan, it helps us to focus conservation efforts in different parts of the world. Had to put this one in because my wife's here and this is her favorite bird. Wood thrush, and if you ever heard it sing, it's got to be among your favorite too. It's a flute-like song. It actually sings on two different pitches at once during part of its song. It is much like the magnolia warbler. It's spread out a little bit more. The reason I put this in is it actually shows 2-week intervals. So imagine the information that a conservationist or a person like me can get out of this to realize that during April into mid-May, they're concentrated in this part of Virginia, and is there a link to caterpillar outbreaks? And if caterpillar outbreaks, does that include gypsy moth and other things that are killing trees? And are the wood thrush there in time to be getting the caterpillars that are killing the trees? And how does all this tie together? And what does it mean for national forests and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuge public lands? I said I would mention a little bit about abundance. Partners in Flight has a mission since its beginning in 1990 to keep common birds common. And that is, we work under, we provide a niche that's currently unfilled, in that most management is crisis management for an endangered species or harvest management for a huntable species. Two ends of the spectrum that are very, very important. However, there's a huge number of birds and other wildlife out there that are abundant, but we need to keep them abundant, not only for economic reasons, but for ecological reasons and for societal reasons. I strongly believe, that there's a societal expectation of government to help care for and provide an abundance of these species for society to enjoy, just like we did this morning. Not just 1 or 2 birds here and there, but in abundance. An ecological necessity, I also just hit on a little bit, that birds eat insects and insects kill trees. And to keep those things in balance, we need a certain ecological abundance to maintain the system. I don't expect you to be able to read this slide, but the main point I wanted to make was that this whole list of birds is a category that is particularly important to the work that I do. It's a list of birds that still has tens of thousands of individuals, maybe a few 100,000 individuals, and yet their population decline is rapid. They may have lost as much as 60 or 70% of their population since 1960. However, and if the trend continues, they'll lose another 50% of their population in the next 25 years or less. So these birds are not birds that you would necessarily consider, that you wouldn't, and by any means, consider endangered. And yet, if we don't do something now, our children and grandchildren will be saddled with the expense of endangered species management, which nobody really wants to get into that situation. Sometimes we're forced to, but it's expensive and it's tough. So let's keep abundant birds abundant. Now, as I finish up here, I wanted to talk about the importance of places like Lake Monticello and the area here around Waynesboro. When birds migrate, where they stop is important. It's called Stopover Sites by some people. That's the slide here. There are several places here locally to see birds in migration, and they stop or pass over. Just 30 minutes from here, maybe 45? Yeah, probably 45 minutes from here towards Waynesboro at Rockfish Gap, right on Blue Ridge Parkway if you're headed west. Every day from mid-September till the end of November, there's a fall hawk watch. Somebody this morning said they had just been. Is that person here? Denise here today, this afternoon? Okay. They have volunteers there every morning. This is the view on the left, and this is a nice kiosk to help you identify hawks as they fly over on the right. There's always a volunteer there during most of the day. It's behind an old hotel. The hotel looks like it's not even occupied anymore, but go behind the hotel. You'll see a little concrete pad, and you'll see people sitting there in lawn chairs saying, 4 Cooper's hawks, 2 peregrine falcons. And on a really good day, they might say 10,000 broadwing hawks. It's an incredible migration when you hit it just right. And it takes a special day. You can't go there every day and see 10,000 birds fly over your head. But there are days in most fall seasons where broadwing hawks come right down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. They wait a little bit, so you don't even have to get up early. You can get there at 8:30 or 9 o'clock. They wait for the thermals. They come up on the thermals. And then it's I've never witnessed a 10,000 hawk day, but I've seen a few thousand pass, and it looks like small tornadoes of hawks coming at you, and then you can see them right over your head, and it just keeps coming. It's a remarkable view, and if Paul and Diane invite me back next year, maybe we'll take a trip over to Rockfish Gap with the Wildlife Committee and anybody else who wants to go. But here are a few things around the community, at least, that I thought about, and we can use this for a basis of discussion or question and answer. I know Paul has a little more to say. High-quality habitat is important. It means shelter, fresh water. If you want migrating birds to stop in close to you, like on your porch, try to make that dripping water. That's what they cue into, is the drip often, and they will find it. And food resources. Your feeder won't necessarily get birds in migration, but native plants will. Keeping some of your trees that produce the insects they want will. Keeping cavities around will also help. Will help attract birds in that season. And think about community open spaces. You know, everybody has their own backyard, and there are things you can do, but every community also has open spaces. The golf course here looks like a great example to be able to, some edges to put in native season grasses and a few shrubs and other things would make for a good migration stopover habitat. Pat just mentioned earlier she's had a great spring migration watch just right here in the woods in these trees behind the clubhouse here. Native habitat is best, including shrubs, as I said, native shrubs. One of the issues that is just unfortunately too true all over the eastern United States is an overabundance of deer, and they eat down the shrub layer that birds need to both nest and to use during migration. I'll leave it at that. But deer can overgraze and create less good habitat for birds. Ensure safety from predators. I put down here especially to think during fall migration about cats. Cats, at least one study estimates that cats across the United States can kill up to 2 billion birds a year. Now those birds might be starlings and house sparrows and birds you want to get rid of to start with. But there are also in there a number of ground nesting birds or birds at the shrub layer that are vulnerable to cats roaming. If you have cats, and I have in the past, they bring all kinds of goodies to lay on your front porch. Well, birds are one of those goodies, and they add up. It's not, it's one of those issues where it's not a single cat, it's everybody's, or it's all the cats that are out here. It's feral cats are an issue. Cats that have been, somebody didn't want their cat anymore, so they just dumped it on the side of the road. Horrible situation, but then that cat's got to make a living, and that cat, has more cats and more kittens, and nobody likes that, but that's part of the issue. And then lots of birds. Birds can't see windows for the most part. If birds are flying through, especially if they're trying to escape a predator, they see a window as open air. So there are several ways to keep birds from hitting windows. You can put a silhouette of a hawk in the window. You can put something more decorative, something that the bird can tell makes it a solid surface, not a fly-through. With that, I'll end. I thought appropriate, since Paul and I worked on the U.S. State of the Birds report in 2009, the first one, to end with a great quote from that report that birds are the bellwethers of our natural and cultural health. They're indicators of the integrity of the environment, and if we keep birds abundant, there's a really good chance that we're keeping our air and water and our natural resources in high quality as well. So watch birds, enjoy birds, use the latest in technology to do so. If you feel like it, contribute your data to eBird and Citizen Science because you see how it's being used. And think about birds as an indicator of how good your environment is. With that, Paul, I'll send it back to you.
Now you see why I like to work with Bob for those many years. Let me see if I can find the last bit of notes I have on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and then we'll open up to questions. This was a great segue because he talked about the things that we can do, and I'm going to give you some ideas at the end of this of things that a thing that you can do to maybe influence national policy, I hope. Well, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is, as I said earlier, is one among the oldest wildlife protection laws that we have. I didn't tell you the details of it, but it was a implementing law, implementing legislation for treaties. We have 4 bilateral treaties. The first one was with Canada. Actually, it was with Great Britain on behalf of Canada. Mexico, Russia, and Japan, all throughout the 1900s. First one was in 1916, next one in Mexico, 1936, 72, and 76, I think, were the most recent treaties. But those are not self-implementing treaties. And so they needed legislation to implement them to create law to uphold our portion of the treaties with those countries. It was recognized by folks in history that we needed to do that because birds actually did migrate. And so if we didn't coordinate beyond political boundaries, we weren't going to protect these birds. Those birds that were on hats and slaughtered in great numbers in the early 1900s. So wise people created these, started and negotiated these treaties and put into place a law that is the foundation for what we do today. And it recognizes that important coordination function across. And it's 100 years of success. There are very few laws that I would suggest that really have that kind of success track record. But the MBTA, I'll shorten it to the MBTA, is credited with saving millions, if not billions, of birds over the course of that time. And why is that? Because the MBTA has this in the statute. It says, it is unlawful to pursue, hunt, take, capture, kill, possess, sell, purchase, barter, import, export, or transport any migratory bird or any part, nest, or egg unless authorized under a permit. And a permit here is read as a hunting season or a physical permit to take a bird, shortened to take, okay? So that was established back in 1918. And take is even further defined in the statute to pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect. Kill is in there, right? Well, that's been an important guiding principle and law for that 100 years in protecting birds from such things as oil pits. When we were developing oil several decades ago, one of the techniques, and still to this day, is that there are waste as a result of drilling for oil, and that waste is put into an oil pit, and that pit was historically open. Well, birds don't recognize it as oil. They would get into it and die. So the law was used to encourage, I'll put quotes around, encourage, require, oil companies to put netting over top of those attractive nuisances or those death traps for birds. So it was effective at preventing birds from dying in oil pits. Similar was done with oil spills, power lines, towers, wind turbines. All these kinds of things are killing birds along with the feral cats that Bob mentioned and a whole host of other things. But the MBTA can be used to encourage, motivate, industry and companies to do the right thing for the environment, in particular, in this case, birds. Well, I no longer work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so I can say this, Bob can't say this. But the Department of Interior has developed in this recent administration, in December of 2017, they issued a policy that is completely different than every other administration over the last 100 years, okay? It has interpreted this Migratory Bird Treaty Act to only prosecute or only apply, I'll say apply, to people who intentionally or acts that intentionally take birds. Nowhere in the statute does it say there's a distinction between the intent to kill and killing. So what that did was essentially let oil companies, Exxon, read into this Exxon Valdez, which, by the way, I was in Alaska during the Exxon Valdez, and I saw many oil bird as a result of that spill. The BP Horizon, wind turbines, oil pits, now the things that we had encouraged the industry and companies to do, the right, in my opinion, the right thing, things, technology that can be used to prevent damage. Or in the case of those spills where there was damage, it wasn't intentional, but that there is at least a cost to society, and that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was the vehicle for us as citizens to recoup some of the loss that we had as a result of the loss of those birds during those oil spills. Well, under this new interpretation, that is no longer illegal. And so I have begun my own little campaign, if you will. I contacted essentially every career and political leader still alive who were involved in migratory birds over the past 40 years, including an assistant secretary for President Nixon. And we all signed a letter to this administration encouraging that they reconsider this policy. We yet to this day, we sent that in January. We haven't received a response to that letter yet. And we need to, and so we've done some, I'll say some outreach communications to newspapers and the like, and you may have read some of that. We continue to this day, and there are going right now 3 lawsuits that are active. Some non-governmental, nonprofit conservation organizations are suing this administration. The Natural Resources Defense Council is in another lawsuit, same topic. And 8 states have taken up the issue as well. So you're not going to be involved in a lawsuit, but if you have the time and the energy, I suggest you write your political leaders, any ones that you can identify. We identify the representatives, senators, et cetera, to encourage them to do the right thing and return to the time when we can use this great law to help us as citizens to protect these valuable resources we've been talking about for the past hour. So that's my political statement for the day. And with that, I just turn the lights on and we'll open it up to questions. And I hope you ask hard ones, and Bob will be here to answer those.
Now I remember working for you.
That's the way it goes, Bob.
No, you're not going anywhere.
I know.
Thank you. That was a great program. Regarding the MBTA, will other countries try to put pressure on the United States to keep up our fair share of the act?
Yeah.
And secondly, I had 2 questions here.
Yep.
Secondly, we've got this pipeline going in over in Nelson County and that part of the state, which my understanding is that they're going to be taking down trees, which again will have an unintentional consequence on migratory birds. Can anything be done through the act to stop that?
Okay, those are 2 good questions. Second one's much harder, but I'm going to start with the first one, and I'll probably do a tap dance on the second one a little bit. But the first one is fairly easy. We are very, very close to our northern partners in Canada in terms of migratory birds, and Mexico to some extent. Less so with Japan and Russia. Actually, we do have some connections with them on the treaty, but it's more infrequent. Canada has already raised this issue with in informal way, and are debating whether to, on a formal basis, meaning from prime minister to president, to raise this as an objection. They have, that's always tricky, right? Because there's trade and all those things that are much in people's mind bigger than this. So they're trying to sort out how important this is in the scheme of the concerns across country. But I can assure you that my counterparts, my former counterparts, I guess I should say, that are in Canada have raised this issue and are concerned. Why would you, are asking the country to consider that this is fundamental to the treaty that we have and that it should be rethought. The second question is a really tough one. There are permit systems in place whereby the pipeline has the authority or the ability to request permits for such actions. With this new interpretation, unless the bird is endangered or there's something else that is being affected by the removal of those trees, they may not be required to get a permit specifically for birds, for instance, unless it's endangered under this new interpretation. So I don't know exactly what can be done to kind of raise that issue other than, as I said, to return to a policy that I think is more fundamental and important to us. Hope I took care of that second one. I had to dance a little bit on that one. Other questions? How about the migrations or anything like that? Bob. Paige.
Please wait for the mic. And would you stand, please? Thank you.
I was watching something last night on the migration of birds to South America, and they were talking about global warming. Do you have any comments on that?
A little bit, yes. And I did not hit global warming as much as I'd originally thought and that Paul and I originally talked. So I'll be glad to answer some questions about that. But broadly, let's see, where to start. There are some birds that are clearly moving farther and farther north in their breeding range when they come back to the United States, which indicates something about their habitat moving north. There are some publications out that you may have seen. Baltimore Orioles may no longer be in Baltimore in 50 years, things like that, that are science-based. It's not for sure, but they are science-based, and I think reliable predictions that some of these birds are going to have to shift north. So let me start on the northern end and then get to the southern end. Part of the issue, two things. A good friend of mine, I work with a guy in Alaska. You have a lot of experience in Alaska, and there are birds that nest right on the edge of the tundra, right, or just right on the edge, and that's a low grass, low area, few shrubs maybe, but certainly no trees. Well, the trees are starting to move into that area much, much farther north at much faster pace than anyone ever expected. And they're taking hold, is it white birch maybe? Anyway, there are some trees that are moving in that the birds that nest on the tundra can't handle. They won't nest in that kind of habitat. And the prediction is, he's a good climate scientist as well as a good ornithologist, those trees will eventually reach the coastline and essentially push those birds that need the tundra to nest basically into the ocean. There will be nowhere for them to nest. And that's a climate change issue by my definition. Bring it back a little bit further south. I just worked 2 weeks ago on a species called Kirtland's Warbler. It's an endangered species. Population has recovered. It's been great. It's fantastic. It nests only in Michigan, maybe some in Canada. Spend the winters in Bahamas. Not a bad lifestyle. But their nesting success is strongly tied to a caterpillar outbreak when they begin to nest, so they can feed their young and keep the adults healthy. Well, if the caterpillars decide to emerge 3 weeks earlier because it's warmer, but the Kirtland's Warbler stays on its same arrival schedule, it's going to arrive after all of those caterpillars are emerged and gone. It's an issue called phenology, mismatched phenology. But it's definitely a mismatch in ecology, which can cause some pretty serious problems. For birds going south, it's the same issue, the mirror image of the same issue. There are unexpected droughts, unexpected heat, trying to get across the Gulf of Mexico, the obstacle here in the United States, eastern United States, which is the big obstacle, be much more difficult because of weather patterns. Hurricanes that come across are stronger. There's not necessarily more hurricanes, but the hurricanes that are hitting us are much stronger. And it happens during fall migration. A lot of birds are moving in July and August, and hit those hurricanes. During my talk, I told you there are a million stories about migration that I love. One recent study, for example, had a shorebird tagged with that satellite. This satellite transmitter is giving us so much information that wasn't available before, but it was Great Bear Lake? Great Slave Lake? Yes, thank you. It was banded at Great Slave Lake, and we know that it spends the winter, occasionally has a stopover in the Caribbean, but usually spends the winter in Brazil and Venezuela. But what we didn't know, the satellites have now shown us, that it will leave Great Slave Lake in Canada, go east, and fly out over the ocean in one of those nonstop 8-day flights, just like the Godwit, make it almost all the way to Africa, in fact, and then circle back around and make it to the Caribbean. And that's a reason because of, well, why? That's a reason because of both the Earth's rotation, the physics that I don't fully understand, but I do understand that it does that in the fall because it catches the winds from those hurricanes. And once it gets over to the head of a hurricane, it doesn't even have to flap its wings for like 4 days, you know. It can, yeah, right. And the interesting story about this one banded bird, they could literally watch it in real time. Brian Watts at University in Maryland. He could watch it in real time. The bird went off. It hit a huge hurricane off the East Coast. It wasn't Sandy, but it was one that came farther north than usual. Bird slowed down to like almost 2 miles an hour trying to make it into the headwind. You know, they're thinking, oh, this is a dead bird. Our satellite's gone, etc. It's 2 miles an hour. Sometimes it felt like it was going backwards. But then it made it, then they thought, well, it'll come back to inland. It'll figure its way back inland. It didn't. It just stuck out the hurricane. But once it made it past the eye of that storm and made a big curve, it came in like 80 miles an hour back into the Caribbean and landed safely in the Bahamas. It's an incredible story. So hopefully there are two things to that story. One is climate change is a serious issue and it will affect especially birds that migrate long distances. The last story is one that maybe we don't know enough about these birds, and some are able to adapt and deal with changes much better than we think, we hope.
I would just, I'll add to what Bob said just briefly. I just came from a conference a few days ago where recent information suggested some of the more popular waterfowl, in fact, are delaying their migration, and they've noted this for about a month. I mean, in other words, they've delayed, in just a few short years, they've delayed their migration south by a month's time, which is, I mean, a significant change in the life history of waterfowl. So, as Bob said, we don't know what all this means. We do know it's happening, despite deniers in the world. We know that this change is happening, and their evidence is all around us of it, and it's clear that it's happening. Now, what can we do about it? That's a whole nother debate, but it is clear that it's going to affect bird populations. Though those that can adapt, as Bob has indicated, may thrive, and those that don't adapt that fast may not. So, any further questions?
Yeah, this question is for both of you, and I'm very curious to know if you're familiar with the biologist E.O. Wilson,
Yes.
author, and one of his latest theories or cries for reason is to establish half the Earth as a natural habitat for all the different species around the planet to maintain a biosphere that will survive into the future.
You want to take E.O. Wilson? He's a brilliant author. Yeah. And
Go ahead first.
Okay, I'll just say in general, I have a tremendous respect for E.O. Wilson. He's just a brilliant guy. And some of it I understand and some of it I don't totally. So it's, I think you should pose that to him, that question, because it makes, there's some sense to it, but that's a huge cost to society, and whether we can debate that. But he is, he's sort of the Albert Einstein of the ecology, if you will, and read his books if you haven't. He's a tremendous thinker. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit more and maybe be additive to Paul. A lot of the conservation theory in the last 20 years, and if you're reading E.O. Wilson, you're familiar with this. And I've started, or at least at one point in my career, I worked with the Nature Conservancy, and big fan of the Nature Conservancy, but their philosophy at the time was one piece at a time. If an endangered plant occurred on 20 acres, you buy 20 acres and protect the plant. The alternate view was working landscapes, that public and protected lands are integrated into how humans use the landscape. And I think that that's probably the only real solution, and I don't know how to get there by any means, but to increase, to maintain the biological diversity of the earth and the ecological systems that are so integrated, it has to be some piece protected, some piece just for humans, and some piece where humans can actually work more in conjunction with the natural system. So to follow on.
That's good.
Thanks
How
for
long do we have this room for? I don't know. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, thanks for being here today. You
You're welcome.
touched on wind turbines.
Yes.
So is this a really serious problem? Is it propaganda, or can birds and turbines live in harmony together?
Three questions. I'll wrap them all together in one. I've done a lot of thinking about wind turbines. I'm a big proponent and a big fan of renewable resources, renewable energy, and that's one component part of it. But to think naively that they are safe for birds is naive, because there are cases, particularly the earlier generations of wind turbines, were deadly for particularly raptors. They couldn't see them, right? And there were collisions associated with it. And if you can think about, when you look at a wind turbine, it looks like it's going slow, right? From your eyesight, from your distance, etc. But look at it again at the tip of that, and it's going around very fast and invisible. So there are ways, and they're getting better at designing them. For instance, some of the early wind turbines had a lattice structure to support the turbine. Well, those are great perches for raptors. So raptors would naturally go to those perches and collide with the turbine or the blade. So, long way of saying some birds identify them and some birds don't. It turns out bats, and we need to care a lot about bats. A lot of bats are impacted by wind turbines because of the differential. Surprisingly enough, you think they can see everything. It's the differential pressure in the air pressure on the two sides of the wind turbines. And so the bats will come, and honestly, they explode from the differential air pressure near a wind turbine. So there's all kinds of issues. Main thing is to think about the sighting, where you site them in terms of migration corridors and populations. You won't want to put one at Rockfish, where we've got a lot of raptors. The structure itself, the ability to identify and to turn them off when key migration points are occurring, all kinds of things to think about. And that's always getting better. And I'm going to put my pitch in again. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act gave me, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, the ability to use this, how to put this, pressure wind companies to do the right thing, to find places to put them safely and to minimize the impact. I don't, Bob, he can't say this, he doesn't have that tool anymore to use to influence those sightings because of the change in that policy. So that's a negative thing. But saying all that, it's, wind turbines are here. They're, a clean energy. They're not always green, if you will, in terms of they have impacts. And I've described a couple of them.
Only if you'll hold me.
By the way, she's asking her question. I'll say that doesn't mean that wind turbine companies aren't going to do that voluntarily on their own. And I don't mean to imply that, because I've dealt with many companies who are good corporate citizens. But this allows for those that aren't such good corporate citizens to even be worse, if you will. Go ahead.
Hi. To speak to Lake Monticello in particular, are there any waterfowl or bird species that come to our lake that we ought to be mitigating, watching for, making sure we control their population?
Good question. Controlling. Well, there you go. Give me a. I took it a different way. We have some that. Yeah, no, I hear you. It's over. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. So there's two ends of the spectrum, and I co-wrote a paper a few years ago about the bell curve. Most of you who think about or know about the world in a way, think of things in a bell curve. You know, we used to think, teachers are thinking of bell curve. But there's a whole middle of the bell curve of species of birds that are very abundant. That's what Bob was talking about earlier, is keeping those abundant. On either end, turns out, are the ones that we cause most of us to focus on, those that are overabundant and those that are declining or endangered or how threatened, whatever we might term them. Turns out that there's a great deal of evidence that suggests that bell curve is flattening out. And so that's a bad thing, right? Because it's a natural bell curve that shows most birds and most wildlife species are perfectly common and abundant, but not overabundant or underabundant, if you will. And where I'm going with that is that we spend most of our time on the two ends. In the case of Lake Monticello, I've noticed there are some overabundant species. And, there are some that, like in terms of birds, I would say Canada geese, okay? Because they've got a great setting here. And I can give you national examples as well, but you asked about Lake Monticello. So, and there are going to be some that are on the other end and that need our attention from their declining. But I'm right at the moment having a hard time thinking of ones that I would call your attention to. And that's where, Bob, do you have any thoughts about this part of the world, what species we ought to be worried most about?
Thinking of the bell-shaped curve, several of those species were mentioned. Yeah. They're definitely on the sliding part into that tail of declining, like tree swallow, Prothonotary warbler, right. The cavity nesters, all woodpeckers. Yep. Birds that catch insects on the wing, ecologically they're known as aerial insectivores. But that whole group of birds is in decline. Tree swallows is an example that would benefit by there.
That's a great one.
So no endangered species, which is a good thing by my mind, but species that could definitely help keep in that trend.
Okay, so very practical things.
Yes.
Okay, thinking in terms of the environment around, the homes and all. What is the feeling with the responsibility with insecticides and weed killers with the birds?
I'll throw my sense out, and then Bob can follow on. But he mentioned the biggest killer I know is feral cats. In terms of things that we can do, pesticides is on the same. It's pretty high on the list too, honestly. We know that between birds and pesticides, those are the vast majority of bird deaths, just plain and simple. So practical use is follow the label and its use. And preventing it from spreading is pretty important, particularly in an environment like we have here at Lake Monticello, if you're asking for practical. Because simple, we had Florence a few weeks ago or a couple months ago, whenever it was. Just need to look out at the lake the next day to see what we mean about a watershed. Everything that's up here is going to be down there, right? It just is it's a physics thing. And that includes pesticides. And they're going to end up there, along with all the mulch that I saw in the lake, which was plentiful. That's my 2 cents on pesticides. You really have to be careful about pesticides. And you won't insult Bob or I if you decide to leave because of questions. But we'll only take a couple more because we probably want to let everybody go.
Can we get a copy of your list of birds that you had up?
Was that yours?
That are in that middle of the bell curve?
Let's see, 2 things. I anticipated a different question, but yes, yeah, that list could come up with. I'm sorry.
Cornell.
Is that from the Cornell website?
It would have to be worked on just a little bit to make it applicable to this area, but you can, yes is the short answer. You can go to Cornell eBird. If you just Google that or look it up, it's an amazing tool. You can actually just put in say, I want to know the birds in my area, basically, and the map will take you to right here thanks to GPS, and then the GPS coordinates will generate a bird list for this area. So you can have that, but then it has to be kind of worked on which birds are declining. One, as a point at Chris here, I won't put you on the spot, but don't worry. You mentioned a Facebook page, Lake Monticello Bird Lovers Group. If you're on Facebook, I'll send to Paul or either join the group myself the list of birds that we had this morning over at the park so people get an idea of what's around this time of year. But I could also post something like that on that list or get it out to, would that be all right, through the Wildlife Committee? Maybe send it to Paul and you can do it that way. Okay, give me some homework. I like that.
You mentioned that the birds are banded and that the banding is going through satellites. What is it? Is it using GPS as the coordinates? And then is it a two-way transmit or is it just a one-way transmit where you then have to pick up the bands again and basically get the data?
It's yes to GPS. I think it's slightly more complicated, but you may know more than I do, to be perfectly honest. It is a GPS locator. How it's tracked, the specifics, all that, I couldn't tell you. It is one way, so you have to catch the bird. Well, yes and no. The shorebird I described, I said was real time, and they're using a different type of satellite tracker because the bird is bigger and can carry a heavier weight, and so that satellite tracker is more real time with satellites, as I understand it. They can actually follow the birds. The same is true with golden eagle tracking now. Yes, I think so. That would be it then, yes. Very good. I like it. Right.
However, would you
Let the record show I'm nodding my head humbly.
would you repeat that so that the video has that question? Please, I'm serious.
You might want the microphone with her if you want the.
Oh, sorry. So what was so you were saying for the bigger birds it's two-way tracking, and so I'm assuming that I mean I'm a NASA engineer, so
Yeah.
so I'm guessing it goes through the GOES satellites, which have a two-way tracking through the SAR beacon, which is search and rescue, but they open up that frequency band to other ways of you could transmit other things through there, is my guess.
Right.
Does that sort of jive with your experience?
It does, yes.
Okay.
I can certainly give you the reference for the paper. It's Brian Watts at William and Mary, what I couldn't think of earlier, who's doing that work. But the smaller songbirds often use MODIS towers.
Oh, yeah.
And pick up birds that way. But you have to catch the bird again, right, to get the data off the. But that goes back to site fidelity. These birds are coming exactly back to the same spot. And so if they band 25 or 30 birds, they can get 4 or 5 back or more and have a decent shot at the insight into what they're doing.
Okay, so I want to give some thank yous and a couple of notes for people. I want to thank our speakers for a great program. I want to thank the broadcast committee for all the work they do. You know, and on the couple of notes, one is, Bob, you'll be pleased to know that as we monitor what happens in the bluebird houses here at the golf course, we also get tree swallows nesting in them.